Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're 1 minute after the top of the hour, so I thought I would go ahead and get started. And as folks are joining us, we will welcome them. But thank you all for coming today for our Our Maps Minnesota campaign, Census Reunion and Redistricting Kickoff. We're really thankful that you're all here today with us in this space. Today, here's an agenda of how we're hoping to spend our hour together. We'll start off with some welcome, talk about the census and kind of celebrate some victories there. Then we'll spend some time going over the Our Maps Minnesota campaign overview. And then we really want to spend a good chunk of our time today in community with each other, having some conversations about what redistricting means to us and how it may impact us, and also an opportunity for us to learn from you. And then we'll wrap things up with some engagement opportunities in the future. And so as we're getting started, if everyone could introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, or your organization, and what you would hope to learn today, that would be wonderful. And with that, while everyone is doing that, I'll introduce myself and then pass it on to some other speakers who you'll be hearing from today. My name is May Yang. I am the Public Policy Manager with the Minnesota Conflict Foundation. And I am also the campaign manager for the Our Maps Minnesota campaign. With that, if Katina, you would like to introduce yourself, that would be awesome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katina Mortensen. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Minnesota Council on Foundations. I use she, her pronouns, and excited to be here today with all of you. And I'll hand it over to Anastasia.
Good morning, everyone. Excuse me, my allergies are hitting me hard this morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I am Anastasia Belladonna Carrera, Executive Director for Common Cause Minnesota. Totally stoked that we're here this morning, and I will hand it off to Paul.
Thanks, Anastasia. I'm Paul Huffman, he, him, and I'm the redistricting coordinator for League of Women Voters Minnesota. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Katina, Anastasia, and Paul. And again, if you're just joining us now, we're doing a quick round of introductions. If you would like to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, your organization, and what you hope to learn today, that'll be really great to help ground us and get to know each other. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about the census and then some highlights, and Katina will be sharing for this portion here.
Thanks, May. So I have the privilege of being able to talk about the census, and I know I sent many of you a note today, if you were involved in census or are funder engaged in this work, that it's April 1st, and that is intentional. We chose this day because it's exactly 1 year from Census Day, which was April 1st, 2020, and 2 years from April 1st, 2019, when many of us were together in person at the Capitol advocating for census funding from the state. And so this has been a meaningful day for many of us over the last several years, and we thought it was fitting to come back to celebrate the work we did on census and to look ahead to what's next. So many of you were involved in the Minnesota Census Mobilization Partnership, which was focused on achieving a fully inclusive, nonpartisan, accurate census count, and had a particular focus on ensuring historically undercounted communities were counted in the 2020 census. MCF got engaged in this work in large part because we have a commitment to strengthening democracy and view an inclusive democracy as foundational to our civic life, and also to achieving the many other issues and achieving progress in the many other issues that we all care about. We think having a functioning democracy and a democracy where people are seen and included and represented is critical to achieving progress and achieving more equity in our state. So for those of you that were involved in census, you know that we all worked together in 3 main ways. One was through advocacy, advocating at the state and federal level to ensure that both the Census Bureau and our state provided funding for this work, and to push back against some of the harmful policies that were attempted to make the census feel threatening or less accessible. So the advocacy work was an important piece of our work. We also collaborated together on a number of special projects that were specific to Minnesota. And I would say the highlight and kind of the biggest one was the Minnesota specific communications and mobilization plan created by a group of we called them the co-creation table, but a group of historically undercounted leaders from historically undercounted communities came together to create that work. And then the third piece, the kind of most recent piece of the work that many of us engaged in was the organizing and mobilizing, getting out the word about the census, making sure people knew how to respond, knew how things were shifting given the pandemic. And that was, you know, April 1st last year, that was when all of us were shifting to digital and to having a broader array of things we were thinking about as the pandemic came on. So I'm not going to pull up this website right now, but I did want to reference it because we did work, and I know many of our partners were interviewed for this. We did work to create a census impact story to kind of share the cumulative and collective effort that we all did on the census. And I'll highlight a couple numbers of interest. Collectively, there were about 300 organizations involved in the census work, and Minnesota was able to achieve the highest self-response rate in the country at 75.1%. And I think that all of us had a lot to do with that. Between public and private philanthropy dollars, we raised about $4 million to support this effort in Minnesota, and about 1.3 million people were reached through this effort. So despite many challenges with the census, both from the administration and from the pandemic and other pieces, I think we can all feel really proud of what we were able to achieve together. And really, we were able to stay focused on our goal of ensuring that historically undercounted communities were counted. So we feel really good about the work we all did together, and I hope that you all take a moment to celebrate, and if you haven't had a chance yet, to take a look at this report, because I think many of you will see yourselves and your stories reflected in that work. And so May, can you go to the next slide? So at MCF, as the census wrapped up, we started looking towards what's next and moving from focusing on being counted to being seen and represented, and looking at redistricting. And we saw this as the next step within the census work. All of us worked and spent a lot of time trying to ensure that historically undercounted communities were counted. And we see redistricting as kind of the logical next step, now thinking about the same historically undercounted communities, making sure that historically undercounted communities are represented. And likely they've been historically underrepresented if they've been undercounted, but making sure that they achieve fair representation, because that's really critical to being able to have influence and power and the ability to create policy that works better for community. So for us, it's really important to continue in this work and transition to redistricting. And I know that many of the census partners have already made this transition as well. And I'm sure some of you are here because you're interested in thinking about it. So we'd really love to have you engaged. I know that May is going to give us a broader overview of the campaign, but I'll just share one story that we've heard as we've talked about redistricting, is specific to the in Minneapolis. Before redistricting happened in 2011 last year, the urban Native community was divided across, I think it was 4 different wards in Minneapolis, and was not well represented because their numbers were divided. And through the redistricting process, the last time around, became more unified in a single ward, and therefore increased their collective voice and power. And so we really see redistricting as a way to maximize power for historically underrepresented communities, and that's I think why we're doing this campaign. And I'll turn it over to May to share more about the campaign. Thank you all for your work on the census.
Definitely. And so that's exactly what's grounding us in our guiding principle for our work into redistricting and the Our Maps Minnesota campaign. I thought I would spend a little bit of time today to ground us all with a quick refresher on redistricting. And so redistricting is a process used by governments to withdraw or to redraw political district boundaries. And it applies to all levels of government where district elections are held. So from school districts to also like counties and things like that. Redistricting is based on the principle that one person, one vote, which really helps to ensure that each of our voices are represented fairly by creating districts that have the same number of people. And that again, census data is used to draw new maps to account for the ways that populations have changed and moved across states and districts. And so why is redistricting important? Katina talked a little bit about it, but that, you know, the way that the district lines are drawn greatly influences who runs for public office and who is elected. And so this redistricting is really about power because whoever's elected and who our representatives are make decisions that impact us, from ensuring safe schools, affordable housing, economic investments into our communities of color, and then also establishing parameters for public safety and adopting immigration policy. These are just a few examples of how redistricting ties into power and the ways that the lines are drawn and how that affects us. And so again, you know, whoever lives in a district, you can influence whether elected officials are going to feel obligated to respond to your community's needs. And that, again, these boundaries are drawn for 10 years. And so they have great impacts now, and their policy impacts can last well beyond that. And redistricting is important because at times it has been used to exclude communities from political power. And so it's really important for folks to participate because by being a full participant and monitoring the upcoming redistricting process, historically underrepresented communities such as the African American community, the Latinx community, the Asian American community, and Native American and Indigenous populations will have the opportunity to elect candidates of your choice to ensure that your voice and your interests are heard and represented. And so who is in charge of redistricting and when does it occur? So in Minnesota, the state legislature is responsible for drawing maps, both at the congressional and state level. Local governments are responsible for redistricting their own districts. And again, this process typically takes place 1 year after the census. But for us here in Minnesota, the local areas will also have their own timelines for this process. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Census Bureau has pushed back its data release to September 30th, 2021. But that doesn't mean that there isn't work that can be done now. And so it's really important that, you know, we start to organize and to be informed of this process so that, again, we can do that monitoring and be engaged to help ensure that our communities are represented. And one way that we're really hoping to do that is through the Our Maps Minnesota campaign. And so our campaign is a nonpartisan grassroots campaign committed to community-focused and transparent redistricting in Minnesota. We're committed to working with community to ensure public input in how maps are drawn. We're really moving forward with the idea of our maps and our power. And how we get there, I'll spend some time today talking about the goals, our strategy, and a timeline with some key important dates to consider. And so our three main goals are to, again, really empower historically underrepresented BIPOC communities to be engaged in the redistricting process. We also want to promote reform that increases community ownership over the process and to promote community-focused redistricting. And lastly, we want to achieve fair legislative and congressional district maps that reflect input from communities and in particular BIPOC communities. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about each of our strategies at a high level. And so one strategy is public awareness and storytelling. Our goal here is to really, again, raise awareness about redistricting within our communities and also through local media and particularly ethnic and community media. Some activities that will support that goal are, developing messaging and stories about why redistricting matters to help the broader public, and especially developing messaging and materials that are going to be culturally relevant to reach our BIPOC communities. And again, to be able to relate the issue to topics in key issues that our communities are already working on and care about. Our next strategy is organizing and mobilizing. The goal here is, again, to also build on that education piece about why redistricting matters, but to also advocate that community maps influence the legislative and legal processes. The main activity that we're going to see in this track is mapping BIPOC and other communities of interest to create a unity map that will inform the redistricting process. Our next track is policy and advocacy. Here is where we're really looking at advancing redistricting reforms and influencing all three branches of government to move towards this community-focused redistricting principle. And then some activities that'll help us get there are, really that testimony, right? And so working with community to ensure that community voices are heard in that legislative process. And then some other activities can include social media campaigns that are supporting voter-focused redistricting reforms. Our last two tracks are a legal track, and this is really to help ensure that the maps that are produced comply with the Voting Rights Act, gerrymandering is minimized, and that BIPOC communities of interest are kept whole. Some activities that'll help us get there are filing legal challenges to proposed maps. And then lastly, technological support. Since redistricting is very technical, it's really critical that we have the right pieces and software to help us ensure that mapping is done and complies with the processes that the state's using. And so there's a lot of moving pieces in this, but again, the goal is to really provide technical expertise and assistance to support this campaign, such as mapping tools and support education and research as well. And we'll largely see a lot of that occur in our communities of interest mapping that I referenced in the organizing and mobilizing strategy. And so here is a timeline of some key, most top level dates and important things to consider. And so if we work backwards, February 15th, 2022 is the deadline for Minnesota to have from the final redistricting order and lines drawn. And so how we're wanting to get there now is, knowing that all of these things are going to have to happen with our community and within this campaign. And so by the end of April, we will know the census apportionment data will be released, and we'll know a better sense of congressional seats for our state. And then for our campaign, we were hoping to launch Kickoff, that public engagement and awareness piece there in May. We'll also start to train community to do some mapping so that, again, your mapping can inform the process here in Minnesota. That mapping will largely occur this summer. The census block data will be released in September, and that'll give us the most up-to-date population counts and population totals for our state. After that happens, that's when the state's process for redistricting will largely occur. The legislature will draw maps, hold public hearings, and with a goal of reaching a final map. And in fall 2021, and that's where a lot of public testimony and public hearings will occur. And that's where we're really hoping to use community drawn maps and the narratives that are built from that process to be submitted as evidence in the legislative process. So this is a key time for community involvement to ensure that voices are heard and represented in how the final maps are reflected. And so with that, we're going to move into a breakout so that we all can have some time to discuss with each other and get to know each other a little bit too. I'm going to pass it over to Anastasia, who will introduce these questions, and then I will do a quick demo of Jamboard, which is what we'll all be using to collectively work on and share ideas in. So Anastasia, do you want to introduce the questions?
Yes, thank you, May. So as we've just heard, both Katina and May walk us through, we went from the census work and how important it was to be counted to essentially what May talked about, which is now we need to be seen. And so these questions are really meant to get us towards being seen within the context of the communities of color and other disenfranchised communities that we're going to be talking about. And so I want to tease, we're going to be teasing a little bit more around that our maps, our power that May talked about, and start delving into the dynamics of how do we go from redistricting and the importance of redistricting to connecting it to the civil rights of individuals and collective power, building some of that collective power that May talked about being reflected in the unity maps. That's going to be ultimately the goal of the campaign at the end of that phase. So that's what we're going to be teasing out in this breakout. May, do the Post-it notes then reflect everybody's comments from all the breakouts?
Yes, they should. So thank you, everyone. Welcome back to our large group conversation. It was really fun for me to see all the Post-its populate. Thank you so much for contributing your ideas and thoughts. I will turn it back to Anastasia if you want to, who will lead us through a group conversation of some of the things that were shared.
Hi again. There were a couple of things that came up in our group, and then I actually want to hear from some of the other folks that were in my group. But two of the things that bubbled up was Ileana raised the further connection between some Bible state dynamics and voter suppression. And Jody raised the point of perhaps structural and process baked in inequities. So if the courts come in to kind of tweak minimally those maps, where does the opportunity for the equity lens to be put into the process? And so I'm going to actually call on two more people from my group. If you can unmute and share your one thought very quickly so we can also hear from you. Don't be shy.
And I'll just highlight too that hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm kind of scrolling around so you all can also see what other folks had to share.
Well, and I'll add to that, May. If you don't want to speak up, that's okay. Just make sure that you put your Post-it note in the Jamboard so that we have the benefit of your thoughts on what we discussed in our group, because that would be really helpful too.
You know, I'm going to go ahead and speak up, Anastasia. I was in your group, and you know, the question that I had was how does an independent commission and is that something that we're looking for that we think will help with some of these racial equity issues?
Very quickly to your question, Phil, an independent redistricting commission would be structured in a way that there is equitable, racial, geographic. I mean, there's more control over establishing fair representation of everyone in Minnesota sitting in that body, including political, right, representation, because it's not a nonpartisan commission, it's a multi-partisan commission, right, where you have a certain set of Republicans, a certain set of Democrats, because those are the two major parties in Minnesota, or not major parties in Minnesota, but the traditional, right? And then you would have another group that could be from the Marijuana Party, Libertarians, Green Party members. I mean, so it's more of a multi-partisan body versus a non-partisan body that are guided by specific rules that does not allow for a lot of partisanship as they're drawing those maps.
And I think, on to Phil, Paul Huffman here, just to add on, as compared to the courts, which will make sure the maps are legal, and they'll do the kind of the least change, incremental change to the maps, and they may have communities of interest on their list of criteria, but very low on the list. With a commission, and the courts are going to look at legality. A commission, independent commission, can look at all the people and all those perspectives and establish a policy-based map instead of just a legally based map. And therefore you have a greater opportunity to address those equity issues that are really, really baked into a lot of how the current maps are drawn. So
thanks folks for sharing. I just wanted to highlight some things that I saw from What Do You Know About Redistricting? A lot of, what we're talking about, like there's a lot of inequities in the current process, right? And so also wanting to give space and time to talk about, then how do our communities define ourselves? What are some shared interests and values that need to be reflected in how the process for redistricting is committed? Anastasia, do you want to maybe spend some time talking about this next question that folks spent some time on?
Honestly, I think that most of our time was spent on the first question, but again, I will call on, I know Ileana kind of hinted a little bit at this when she was talking about the Bible states and voter suppression being used. I understood her to also include some of these dynamics of the values that are being reflected in some of those policy things. But I'm also going to call on Ileana because I also sit with her in other spaces and I've heard her talk about this as well. Ileana, can you just very quickly share a couple of thoughts on within the communities of interest perspective and some of the civil rights work or some of the discussion on civil rights that we just had? Can you just share a couple of points on that? And maybe I can call on a different member. I know that Nicole was also on a call if she had some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah.
Oh, go.
Oh no, you can go ahead.
I'll call on Nicole first and then I'll call on Ileana. Or maybe the other way around while Nicole gets back on from mute.
Yes. Anastasia, can you say a little bit more? Like, are you thinking in terms of
So when we talk about communities of interest and we talk about our BIPOC communities, Ileana,
right?
some of
Okay.
the shared interests that we have, and I know I've heard you talk about this before, that's why I put you on the spot and I called you on first.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about who like communities of interest, I'm thinking about people who have like same like racial background. I think it's important to keep those communities together because that's, I feel like, and when you're thinking about building power within your community, whether that's to stop a development project from happening or to demand streets be fixed or something like that, I think it's important to be able to know who your neighbors are and to feel comfortable talking to them. So like when I think about communities of interest, I think about making sure that you're with like the same racial and ethnic background, understanding that of course like they don't I'm not saying that it needs to be like, you know, only this racial background, right? But thinking about thinking about how our culture is extremely important to us and that we all value certain things in our culture. So it's just important to like keep it together. And you know, of course there's intersectionality that you need to be aware of too, of like class and gender and, you know, access to transportation and whatnot. But yes, that's what I'll say.
Right, and that's what I wanted you to tease out, right? And so what you're talking about is the majority minority, this idea of majority minority districts, right? And again, it doesn't necessarily have to just be a race or ethnic based category. It could be majority minority with a variety of different ethnic groups because there are so many commonalities. It could be commonalities that are socioeconomic. It could be commonalities. It could be industry specific in that community. It could be a variety of different things that it could be just be the strength of culture that comes together and kind of forms that space, right? So when we think about Little Earth, when we think about Hmong Village, when we think about these types of areas within our communities, those would be examples of shared interests and values.
So thank you everyone for sharing. I do want to be mindful of time and the energy that you all have shared with us today, and that you committed 1 hour to be with us. We do have another breakout session. And so I don't mean to cut folks off, but you know, definitely feel free to share in the Jamboard still. This is still accessible, that link, but also wanted to be mindful of our next breakout. And so I'm going to ask that we all move together to our next breakout session. And so here, I'll invite Paul if you want to introduce the questions, and then I'll drop in the Jamboard link for our next session, and then we will again be put into breakout rooms and you'll be asked to join. Please make sure that you select yes.
Thanks, May. And just briefly, we're here to talk to you as stakeholders about how can we engage and support you, what barriers are there, and how can we help with engaging in redistricting, because that is, as Katina pointed out, the culmination of getting the census done. There's the funding piece, there's a representation, and we need to follow through and make sure everybody's voices are counted and voices are heard through this. So 2 questions to help us, and think about that, and as we go into the breakouts. Thanks, Meg.
Okay, it looks like we have most people back. Paul, I'll turn it over to you to facilitate some sharing out from breakout number 2.
All right, thanks, May. And I know that I just, again, like Space, I want to be respectful of time. What we're getting at here, as I said, is what people need. And I think what came through in a group that I was with, and I'm looking at the things on the board, have to do with education. Thanks, May. Education, stories, and that's one of our focuses on stories, because we're hearing that on stories and having those in order to give something people can connect to. Hearing from Metro State is that at the census, that really resonated with students, and they got very excited about hearing those stories, and I think we can help with that. And then language accessibility was another one that was important, and we are working toward that, but that's a great thought. If we go to the second one, May, let's just go ahead and jump over there. The barriers and challenges, in our group, it was somewhat the same, which was, with having the information to, make that relevant to folks, because they aren't connecting with it, understanding the community. Victor, right at the end there, was getting some good insight from Victor on this. But, the challenges is making this more visible, and that goes to language again, timelines, and having that messaging to help people in these groups connect with others and help them to make it a priority. Just want to open it up to anybody who was in those groups for anything that you felt was important that I missed out on there.
I think it's important to this is Jody. I think it's important to recognize that in geographically based communities, there are very real conflicts of interest. I say this as a former organizer in a neighborhood-based setting. So even identifying the community or communities of interest is itself layered at minimum.
Absolutely right. Yeah, thanks. All right, I think, and May said that these boards will be live here for a while after this. So if things come to mind, and not everybody can think of these things right off the top of their head, if things come to your mind, go back in, keep the link, and add back to it. And this is going to help us respond to, support you and your interests in this process. Thanks, May.
Thanks, folks. And yes, definitely we'll keep the Jamboard live that you can add to, and also see what other things that folks contributed. And I do want to be respectful of time, and so I will just quickly wrap us up. But thank you all for participating in the Jamboard sessions and the breakout sessions, and sharing your great input and highlighting some really key considerations for us to all consider. And so opportunities for engagement, there are a lot of them. And so the way that we do have some structured meetings now, and within the campaign, we have a steering committee that meets bi-weekly to kind of really oversee strategy. And then from that group, there are various work groups. These work groups really tie back into those strategy tracks that I had referenced before. So we have a work group that's focused on thinking about how do we enact and execute community of interest mapping. We also have a work group that's focused on making culturally relevant education and materials. And so if you're interested in those spaces, please feel free to contact me. The next slide will have my contact information for you, ways that you can be engaged and learn more. And we'll continue to host these stakeholder meetings. They'll probably most likely occur on a monthly basis. And so, if you join today, you will get information about the future stakeholder meetings, and that again, they will be topical. We're probably thinking that, the next future stakeholder meeting, we might spend some time talking about data. right? Or we might spend some time talking about some of those more specific strategies, right? But again, these are a way for folks to be involved from the greater public. And you can also follow us on our RMAPS Minnesota campaign website, which is just rmapsmn.org. And then lastly, like I said, this is my contact information. Feel free to ask me questions, direct those questions to me. I will follow up with you all to share today's slides and links to those Jamboards. And so if you have more things to share, or there's more things that you wanted information on, you can get that, and also feel free to reach out to me here at my email. And so with that, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here, and we look forward to working with all of you as we move to making sure that our communities are represented in the way that district lines are drawn.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.